species has a different look, but by and large, birds of paradise have a pretty wicked aesthetic. For instance, some male birds of paradise have super black wings, which absorb 99.95% of visible light. Others are incredibly colorful, but according to a new study that dropped, most species of birds of paradise have a secret. They are secretly bright highlighter yellow. That is to say, they are biofluorescent. Like, really biofluorescent. Quick fluorescence overview. Most colorful objects that we perceive here in the optical spectrum comes from light reflected back. Say, my shirt absorbs the room light, which contains blue and green and yellow and red because it's white light, all of that. But my shirt absorbed everything except the red, a subset of all the frequencies it received. Fluorescence works differently. When the light hits a fluorescent molecule, that molecule's temporarily excited to a higher energy level. To let off that energy, the molecule then emits photons. Most often, but not exclusively, those photons are at a lower energy level than the photons initially received. That's one of the reasons why UV is a common light source to visualize fluorescence. UV light is higher energy than anything in the visible spectrum, so if a fluorophore receives UV and emits a lower energy photon, lower energy can still be in the visible spectrum. This fluorescence often happens within a range of wavelengths, so something with UV light may also fluoresce with violet or blue light to some extent. By contrast with normal color, my shirt's bouncing back the red EM waves. It's not absorbing photons and re-emitting them in the red spectrum. The photons it does emit are in the lower energy spectra, like infrared. That's why normal colors don't appear glowy the way that fluorescent ones do. Fluorescent things are emitting visible light at us. For our eyes, fluorescence is overwhelmed by visible light in the surrounding area most of the time. You can shine a UV light on something fluorescent in broad daylight, but you may notice it's not nearly as noticeable as when you're shining a black light on something in the dark, which is probably why it took us so long to notice in general how many species of animals fluoresce. The most famous example is probably the jellyfish. Now, not the bioluminescent ones, but the ones like Aquaria victoria that have green fluorescent protein, which biologists now use in countless scientific studies. But beyond jellyfish, we sometimes also talk about how arthropods like scorpions and insects fluoresce. There are plenty of links out there. I will spare those of us who are a little anxious around arthropods. But the truth is, biofluorescence isn't just for invertebrates. There are species of shark, fish, and sea turtles that fluoresce, as do tons of amphibians. In one 2020 study, they studied 32 amphibian species across 14 families, and all of them fluoresced under UV light. This one, the eastern tiger salamander, is probably my favorite from that study. Look at the spots. Biofluorescence also shows up plenty in higher order vertebrates like birds and mammals as well. 5 years ago, researchers found that platypus, of all things, biofluoresce, which frankly, they're already such bizarre little mammals that fluorescence barely makes them weirder. At the time, I figured at this point we should probably just start shining black lights on animals, since apparently flying squirrels are secretly pink, platypus are teal, who knows what animals are secretly hiding biofluorescence. And you know what? Scientists did just start shining black lights on animals, I guess, because we have this paper now about birds of paradise. We can see from this bird of paradise family tree that different species of birds of paradise have different patterns across their body of fluorescence, beaks, plumage, etc. But under UV and blue light, they come out this aggressive highlighter yellow. Lots of species are fluorescent, apparently, but birds of paradise are serious about it. Now, as much as scientists are discovering fluorescence in all these freaking animals, it's not always clear that there's a why to the fluorescence, let alone what that why might be. After all, not all biofluorescence confers a specific benefit. Sometimes it can just be a quirk of chemistry. For instance, our normal human teeth fluoresce, but it's not because there's some kind of evolutionary advantage to it, it's just the chemistry of dentine and enamel. Sometimes the fluorescence isn't about the color light the animal emits so much as the wavelength of light being absorbed. UV radiation is fairly high energy, as we've talked about in other episodes of May Contain Science. That energy can damage and degrade DNA and proteins, as it does to the North American walleye. As solar UV radiation increased in its habitat, the walleye adapted. They've begun to produce enough of this blue protein seen on the left, sandercyanin, which fluoresces red, as we see on the right. The protein itself binds to break down products of UV radiation and accumulates in the fish's skin, giving it a blue appearance. The idea is that when there's enough UV that there are a lot of UV breakdown products, it gives more substrate for the sandercyanin to bind to. The sandercyanin, in turn, emits red light when absorbing UV, dissipating some of the absorbed energy, which creates somewhat of a stabilizing feedback loop to mitigate further UV radiation. So, sometimes biofluorescence is a useless peculiarity, sometimes it helps, like as a UV protection measure. So what's it doing in our birds of paradise? Well, let me give you some circumstantial evidence presented in this paper published by the Royal Society. 1. Birds of paradise live in habitats with fairly high amounts of ambient UV. 2. The fluorescent patches on these birds are sexually dimorphic. That's not surprising, as birds of paradise have extreme differences in appearance between male and female, like many birds where males' colorful feathers are part of attracting a mate. 3. The bird's biofluorescence peaked at 520 and at 560 nanometer wavelengths, our greenish highlighter yellow color, and birds of paradise, wouldn't you know, are thought to have photoreceptors optimized in the 540 nanometer range and contain pigmented oil droplets that may amplify their sensitivity to this range even more. Furthermore, the birds of paradise have fluorescent beaks, as I mentioned earlier, but it's worth noting that a lot of their fluorescent feather spots are in places prominently displayed in signaling and mating rituals, and are even contrasted against non-fluorescent super black feathers. As any fashionista will tell you, that makes the colors really pop. In short, our scientists are making a strong case that these birds are much better than we are at seeing fluorescence in the feathers, and that they're using fluorescence perhaps as another means of adding color to their feathery palette. I mentioned that the fluorescence distribution was different in male versus female birds. In female birds, the fluorescence mostly shows up in mottled areas on their body. In females, our authors hypothesize, it may improve camouflage, as fluorescence does in some other species. No, not because one is extra stealthy when one is covered in bright yellow-green, but in more of a visual noise, dazzle camouflage. There's no way that can be a bird. It's highlighter yellow. That must be a leaf kind of camouflage. So, overall, it seems that the biofluorescence in birds of paradise isn't an accident or a UV mitigation measure. It's adaptive coloration and likely particularly significant in males as part of the mating display. That means that birds of paradise are yet another species on our pile of secretly glowy animals. But in the discussion of this paper, our authors point out, it may not even stop here. Given that most of the bright yellow and white plumage on these birds was biofluorescent, it raises the prospect that other birds with similar plumage may also contain similar fluorophores. There are a lot of birds with white or light-colored feathers. So all I'm hearing is that we have to check every animal for biofluorescence proposal is scientifically warranted. And it would be quite a glow-up.